Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thanks so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, my friend, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What have you brought to the table today?
I have brought a documentary called Class Divide to the table this week. It's set in West Chelsea in New York City, which has seen hyper-rapid gentrification over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
The documentary tells a story of the neighborhood through the lenses of an expensive and exclusive private school called Avenues, the World School. That's the name. Avenues, the World
The
School.
way you said that was kind of funny. I don't know why.
Yeah. Which happens to be right across the street from the Elliott Public Housing Apartments.
Yes.
There are lots of people who are interviewed throughout the documentary from the neighborhood, from the school, from Rosa, who's an amazing little Latina girl from the neighborhood, to Hayashim, who is a young black man in the neighborhood, some students from Avenues School who are mostly affluent and white.
Yep.
The documentary really demonstrates, I think, the stark contrast in the reality of the economy,
Yeah.
right? and the elements of race and immigration status and class. Also, obviously, within that, with the economy having huge influences on the experiences of the people in the documentary that we sort of meet in their interviews. There's a lot here, and looking at my, kind of reflecting and looking at my notes, this documentary feels like a critique of our economic system without the filmmakers really ever coming out and saying explicitly, we are here to critique the economy. It's like, look at the stories and experiences of these people, and that's the conclusion that I came to.
Yeah.
The stories of people and the statistics that they shared throughout kind of do that for them and present that critique.
Right.
So there's definitely lots to talk about. What did you notice as you watched it?
Well, it's fascinating that you say that, this idea of we don't really see the filmmakers, or they don't sort of say it plainly, right? That it's this critique of our economic system. But I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're absolutely right. It's absolutely a critique of our economic system in this country. And so I appreciate that insight. I think I really enjoyed this film. I think there's so much in it for us to talk about. I mean, even just, I hadn't thought too much about immigration, right? And there are pieces of it, of those stories in this too, right? There's so much here. I think it was fascinating and really well done. And I feel like there's so much to learn from a film like this one, right? Especially from the wonderful folks that are featured in it. You talked about Rosa. I think maybe I smiled as soon as you said Rosa. She's my favorite. But so many of the folks featured in this film are kids, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the kids were my favorite part, right? Hands down. There were the kids that went to Avenues where, what was it? Like at the time, the tuition was $40 to $50K.
Yeah.
And then there are the kids in the neighborhood, as you mentioned, at the public housing projects. They're the projects directly across the street, like literally directly across the street. And so, I say that the kids are my favorite because I feel like there was so much that they shared and ways in which they were vulnerable about their lives and their experiences and their hopes and their dreams for their futures, what they want to be when they grow up, and how they were making sense of this class divide, right? Or the socioeconomic divide that exists in the world and in their world. It's sort of ever present for them. And so it was really, I think, amazing to hear them talk about that and reflect on all of that, because I think some of them were so wise beyond their years, right? And on both sides, right? Like they had this sort of, you talked about the kids at Avenues. Many of them were rich and affluent. That's white and affluent. but they had some sort of, many of them had some sophisticated thinking and understanding around like, we are here in this place and literally looking out the window, we see, folks who look very different than us and are living very different lives than us. Right. And vice versa. Right. And so I think for me, their vulnerability, right, and their humanity really shone through, and resonated so deeply with me. And I think there's just so much we can all learn from these young people and their experiences and their thinking about sort of this lens, if you will, of social justice and certainly what it could mean, for our future and what we do about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there was so much that they shared, like you said, that was wise beyond their years of like, oh, that's some really astute analysis.
Right?
Like is what kind of came to my mind is like, yeah, that's like, and it's matching your experience, right? Like
Right.
you're saying that because it is what you have seen,
Yes.
and what you've lived,
Yes.
which is sort of overwhelming to think about too.
It
really,
is.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and then for some of the younger kids featured, particularly the ones that live in Elliott, right? Like, there's also the piece around, and you are just reminded that they are children, right? Because they're talking about, there's one family that's featured, and the mom sort of breaks down because her son just wants to grow up and be able to buy her a home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just wants life to be a little bit better. And so like there are moments where you're reminded that they're children, they're cute kids. But in some ways, all of them show this really, as you said, sort of astute or insightful insight about their lives and their situations and what's happening. So yeah, they were my favorite part.
Yeah, one of the other things, we're talking about avenues. The world's cool. I just found sort of it to be astonishing. Aside from the glitz and glamour of the school itself,
Yes.
The facility is amazing.
Yeah.
And the classrooms and the methods and all that. There were the numbers about financial assistance in the documentary that's the principal. I don't know who that.
Yeah.
Somebody shared.
Their principal, somebody. Yeah.
And so, as I talk about this film came out in 2015,
Right.
And it was filmed before then. So these numbers are at least 7 years out of date,
Yep.
right? But it cost back then, as you said, $40,000 to $50,000 per year to send your student to avenues, which is more than I spent on tuition for my entire bachelor's degree.
Wow.
By about $28,000.
So half of what it costs to go there for a year, half of what it costs to go to Avenues for a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I think I looked back at what average tuition cost for my public school education, public university education in Florida. And
Wow.
yeah, it came out to probably about what's that? $12,000? Yeah, that's $12,000
Wow.
for 4 years. And we're talking 40 for one.
A single year. Mm-hmm.
And that's just tuition, right? So there's additional fees for going to college and room and board and all that stuff. But
yeah, and we should mention that Avenues is K through 12, right? Like it's all right. It was all years. So
right.
Wow.
So aside from that sticker shock on the tuition and just thinking about that math, and yeah, they also shared that 45 students out of the 1,240 who were going there at the time received full financial assistance. So 45 students received full financial assistance and 107 received partial grants. And then they described that as robust.
Yeah.
Which those statistics like that didn't happen in the same conversation. I think those numbers were shown on the screen by the filmmakers.
Yes.
And then the scholarship program was described as robust by an administrator for the school.
Yes.
Like sort of right before. So there was a way that's like, draw your own conclusion on whether or not this is robust. I don't think it is. It's hard to fathom that only 45 students out of your 1,240 when your school is across the street from the Elliott housing projects, where like a family of four, I think there was a number in the documentary, a family of four is making on average less than $21,000 a year. and you're in this neighborhood and you've got 45 students, right, who are on full scholarship and 107 who are on partial. And so it's just hard to fathom because clearly, given your facility, given your, you have lots of access to extensive resources to be able to fund more students to be going there for free.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a piece of it too that I was thinking about what their sort of donor situation may be like as well, right? I'm sure they've got wealthy donors, right? And so they certainly have the capacity to invite the students that live across the street and live in that neighborhood and support them in a way that provides them access to their sort of world-class education. But I think by those numbers, I don't think that's robust. I would completely agree with you. And, if you haven't seen it, this is going to be a spoiler, but, our dear friend Rosa, eventually we see towards the end of the documentary, she, applies to get in and doesn't get in, right? And it really hurt me because I wanted her to get in and wanted her to have access to this education that they're providing that, again, is just across the street, right? So it's this school in their community, and these schools, in my opinion, should be serving the community in which
they are located.
Yeah. So, I appreciate you calling that out because I sort of hollered when those stats were sort of flashed on the screen.
I was like, 45?
40, that's it?
What?
Yeah. That's less than 10%, right? Between full and partial, under receiving that kind of support. So
it's less than 5.
It's less than 5. Wow. Okay. So I tried to, couldn't do that math. So there's that piece. I completely agree with you. That resonated with me. I also think, I sort of alluded to this earlier, but this piece about humanity, or the humanity of the experiences of the folks featured, was such a huge part of this film that resonated with me. And I think the film also does a really great job highlighting the idea that there is a real gap in the lived experiences of folks in this country, right?
Yes,
so obviously this is a look at this West Chelsea neighborhood in Manhattan in New York City, but you can sort of, see that how it applies. And I think the filmmakers are making the case that it applies to other places in the country, right? And so
it's just a stark contrast here, right? Like it's magnified by a huge amount here, right?
Right. Yeah. Because so one of the things that they do, they talk about sort of real estate, right, in this area, right? And so, you have avenues and you have the Elliott Chelsea House projects, right? But then there's also $10 million homes that are also across the street from Elliott Homes, right?
Yep.
And we see sort of a real estate agent sort of taking folks through, and like we get to actually like hear some of what they're talking about as they go on the tours of these locations. And there's a scene of a woman with the real estate agent who's also a woman, and they're sort of sitting in the windowsill of that townhome looking out at Elliott, right? And she's sort of asking her like, would you live here? Would you raise your children here, right? And so there's also this stark contrast of the lived experiences of someone being able to come in and purchase a home or rent a home.
It was purchased.
Yeah, $10 million.
And I also remember because this was the number of square feet in the place was also in my mind. I was like, what? It was like 6,600 square feet or something like it was an absurd amount of space. But it was also $11.5 million or something for the condo.
So you're right. It's a stark contrast, but it's sort of, one example of how this is happening, I think, in sort of many places in our country, particularly, our cities. I think another sort of thing that I was struck by that's related to this is, as you mentioned, some of the like tidbits and quotes and stats that were shared in the film, and particularly the ones that are about the wealth gap in this country. And one of them that just I really struggled with was this idea that it is harder for a child born in America to move out of poverty than it is for children in most other developed countries.
Yep.
Like, what are we doing, right?
Yeah.
Like, how did we get here? How do we get to this place where this is the situation that so many of our children are in. Yeah, I was sort of haunted by that. Like, and I think there's just some real learning and powerful insights that come from a film like this one, when you sort of are, right in front of your face are these children and their experiences, and particularly if you hold some privilege, right, or have blinders on as it relates to these types of experiences.
Yeah. And that stat on the screen, I'm going to talk about a different one in a minute, but
Okay.
that stat on the screen and what you just said about sort of kids in poverty in the U.S. having a harder time getting out of poverty than in other developed countries reminds me there was a study a couple years ago that I don't remember entirely what it was about, but it was essentially about your zip code not defining, but like having a huge amount of correlation to what your opportunities look like.
Wow.
And so they did a longitudinal, whoever the researchers were, did a longitudinal study about sort of poverty and opportunities and all
Yep.
that, by following kids into like sort of early adulthood,
Yep.
and looking at their zip code and that. And so there's longitudinal
Right.
research about that being a fact.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm so imagining that if your zip code is 90210 versus if
Yeah.
your zip code is Baltimore City, like
Right.
right? Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
There's something called, I'm just doing some quick Googling right now as I talk about it, something called Opportunity Atlas, which is from the Census Bureau and Harvard University's Research Institute, Opportunity Insights.
Okay.
So that's something else to kind of look into. And I guess keep in mind is like people are noticing this and doing research and proving that this is not just like anecdotal stuff that
Yes.
that we're making up, that it's a real like class divide,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
as the documentary is called, and you can like it's hard to move upward
Right.
in that system,
Right.
which I think we have as a country sort of always tooted our own horn about. And so, yeah, the statistics and the experiences of people don't actually match up to that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to check that out. That's awesome to know about.
Yeah. So another thing I hadn't really thought about, but it feels connected to this, particularly when you think about zip codes and opportunities. So it was on the screen. Was that a majority of public school students in America are from low-income families?
Yeah.
And I really wonder what that means for the experiences of our students across both public and private schools. If there's little kind of in-school diversity amongst class, what does that do? And like, what does that mean?
What's the impact of that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of also turning that statistic over in my head a little bit. I also wonder, what does it say about the economy at large? Is this actually a change in the population of our public school students? Or is this an indicator of a larger economic shift where proportionally more people are considered low income than in the past?
Right.
And so therefore their students, right, are coming from those low income households.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably its own documentary in itself.
Probably.
And for me, it raises a lot of questions about the purpose of private schools, what it means to have two separate education systems with drastically different funding resources and access to resources. And it reminds me also of Remake the World, we talked about last week, when Asher Taylor talks about the way that our economy creates insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the foundation. It's like it creates insecurity that you then have to respond to and work toward your own security, whatever that looks like.
And in
for
this
you.
case, that we're talking about children, right? So that insecurity is sort of baked into our children, right? Right. And so that, what does that mean as they continue to grow up in the world, right? That if it's literally baked into them that early in their schooling. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it also reminds me of toward the end of the film, I think, there's a quote that they put up on the screen in the documentary from Plutarch, an ancient Greek philosopher, who said an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailments of all republics.
Ooh.
Which, this is an ancient Greek philosopher
Yeah.
talking about it being the oldest ailment of all republics. And it's obviously continuing to this day, thousands of years later.
Thousands.
And so I wonder how fatal this ailment will ultimately be to our republic that we're currently living in.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a lot there. That's a lot. Yeah, it's interesting and it's fascinating to think about. I mean, you're talking about it from the perspective of sort of our what's happening in our public schools, but even sort of thinking about what we saw on the screen in this film with the students at Avenues, right? And they were talking about sort of, some of them were sharing like, I don't think we're particularly well off, but then I had my friends who also go to Avenues come over for a birthday party and, oh wow, we're doing better than I thought, right? And sort of other students talking about they don't know how much folks make or their parents make money, but they don't have money, or just the sort of access to opportunities that they have as a result of that, right? And so, I think there's an argument to be made as you're making about public schools here around what would it mean? What does it mean for students in situations like these students at Avenues to have class diversity, right?
Yeah.
And to have conversations about what it means to be there, and what it means to have conversations around how lucky and privileged you are to be at an institution like Avenues. I think that's fascinating. And that quote, it was at the end, the imbalance. And I'm like, well, if it's the most fatal, oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, the oldest part also struck me as like,
Oh no.
this is an ancient Greek philosopher.
Yeah, and it was oldest at that point?
Right.
Oh boy. Yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. I think so I all that resonates. The other piece that I thought about a lot as I was reflecting on the film was this idea of and I talked a little bit about real estate, right? Like real estate development in that area of New York is booming, right? And you talked about sort of the hyper-gentrification that's happening, right? But all of that is happening alongside, real people and in many cases poor and working class folks who live around all of that, right? And so the film highlighted in particular Hudson Yards, right, which is this private real estate development company, and how it's the largest development project in the country at the time. But specifically how the film sort of looked at how Hudson Yards, the homes there, right, and other real estate in the area, like they're looking at installing individual swimming pools into each of their units, right? Yep. Or car elevators that bring your car up to your floor so you have easy access to it. And I laughed, right? Because I simply just don't see a reason for that kind of luxury. I don't even know what luxury is the best word. Or just sort of need to spend that kind of money for that purpose. Because I think it's certainly then difficult to justify it when there are folks living in some of the conditions that we saw in this film, right? Like, one of the young men who lived in Elliott was talking about how you can't understand what it's like to live in the projects unless you live in the projects, right? Yep. There are days where you don't have any hot water. There are days where you don't have any cold water. There are days where the electricity goes out, right? You're food insecure, like all these things. They talked a lot about the violence, right? And they talked about, someone that they lost to some gun violence right outside of the projects there. And so, you have those conditions literally steps away from potential carports, car elevators and swimming pools in your particular unit. And I really struggle with that, right? Mm-hmm. And I just think about like what it would mean for folks to have the means to improve their living and financial conditions that, so that they can live with more dignity as opposed to us providing these sorts of features in multi-million-dollar homes and sort of what the impact of that would be on our society, right?
Yeah. I think
don't get me wrong, I like to swim like the next guy, but do we really need that.
Yeah, the stark contrast, right, is what really stands out. And yeah, those condos, apartments, whatever they called them, were really sort of astonishing in just how, I don't know, well, like the amenities, like the just how luxurious they seemed.
The opulence of it
Yeah.
all, right? Yeah.
Whew. One of the things that was sort of seemed like a semi-common thread to me throughout the film was the way that folks emphasized class as a more salient piece to them and their experience than race.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Particularly the folks who are from the Elliott houses. But there was one particular quote from Haishim, I believe, where he said, I could go up to an African-American male doctor from a long line of people going to Ivies, and he would look at me like anyone else would look at me, a kid from the projects.
Yeah.
And that was a powerful statement, and one that, in my opinion anyway, points out how class and race combine to create these intersectional experiences with oppression.
Yes.
Where, you've got something in common with this guy, but you've also got a lot not in common with them in terms of sort of generational wealth and what that means and what that access sort of does for you. Right. And it's always been about both of those things and gender and sexuality and more, but it really just put like that story, that quote, what he said, put reality to the theory for me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that I think that's the biggest takeaway from this film, right?
Yeah.
Like the role that class plays. And so I love that you sort of call out and call attention to his quote and sort of what he shares about that, because you're right. Like, you have this thing in common, but this other thing that you don't have in common, like it's like it separates you, right? You're worlds apart from this other human being, right? And so, we talk so much about humanity here, right? Like, there's a piece of humanity that's lost in translation, right? When we think about the intersections of those things. And so that was certainly, I think, one of the most powerful takeaways from this film. So I appreciate you calling that out. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift and talk a little bit about application.
All right.
So when I think about how this documentary influences daily life for us and what it teaches us about our daily lives, I think that the nonstop growth and development that seems to drive so much of our economy is where the lesson lies.
Yeah.
At least, around us and down in DC, the construction has basically been nonstop.
Wow. Yeah.
In our sort of neck of the woods outside of DC, it's been nonstop for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at least. And downtown, there are portions of DC that look completely different than when I got to this area about 10 years ago.
Yep.
And so, I wonder what's the tipping point? At what point do we reach a place where there are more drawbacks than benefits to this, sort of unfettered growth and development?
That's a great question.
What does it do to our economy? Is it helping us? Is it helping all of us?
All of us.
Or is this another sort of money-making scheme for those who already have the resources in the first place? It's like a giant game of Monopoly, where you land on Boardwalk, and the person who owns Boardwalk now has the money to buy houses to put on Boardwalk.
Yes.
And then the next time you land on Boardwalk, you owe more money.
Yeah.
So it feels like that, where it's just like the rich get richer.
Yeah.
So I think we have to start thinking about that, and how do we show up and challenge those things in city council meetings and public comments for stuff that are not always the most accessible things, and stuff like that. So that's where my application kind of where my mind went for this.
Yeah, they're not always the most accessible things. They're not always the most exciting things either.
Oh, no.
but it's a reality that's affecting all of us. Yeah.
Yep.
And I love the sort of analogy of Monopoly. Is it Monopoly in your mind? Because we've been playing Monopoly with your daughter a lot here recently.
Monopoly Junior.
Monopoly Junior, a little bit different, but not. But this idea, it also, when you said Monopoly, it also made me think of like this concept of funny money too, right?
Yep.
Like there's so much of this development that's happening, and like the rich are just uber rich, and these corporations and these developers are just rich beyond measure,
Yeah.
right? And so it's hard for me sometimes to even fathom how much money it's costing for this to happen, right? Again, juxtaposed with the fact that people are living paycheck to paycheck, right?
Yeah.
And people are being forced out of their homes and their neighborhoods. I mean, there's a whole part of the documentary towards the end, right, where folks are protesting sort of that this gentrification that's happening because they're being pushed out of their homes. And there's the woman who gets tearful talking about the fact that this is the home I grew up in, right? I have so many memories here, and now I'm raising my family here, and I don't want to leave here. And so these are the things that we're doing to real people, as other folks are playing with this funny money.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's great application. You know, I think about how, and I think you sort of alluded to this, like how all of this applies to our personal lives, right? And so, you know, as I'm thinking about sort of the conversation that we're having now and sort of all that we saw in this film, right? Like, I think you're right. We have to look at our individual communities, right? And figure out where this kind of gentrification is happening, and the impact that it's having on real people, right? And so I think that's a huge piece of this, right? And sort of this idea of like, who isn't being served by this, right? I think there's so many folks who are just not being served by all that this gentrification that's happening in so many of our communities. And so I think you're right. Like, how are we supporting these folks? Because I think they matter more in these situations, right? You mentioned a couple of things, right? Well, what organizations are out there advocating for these folks? What mutual aid work is happening that we can get involved in, right? Like, you know, you talked about the politicians, elected officials, city council members, right? Like, who can you write to? Who can you, ask to support these folks, right? So what options are out there? What are ways that you can look around in your individual communities to see what's going on and how we can support our folks? I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, you talked about funny money a minute ago, and that made me remember something I saw online recently about sort of wealth in the pandemic, and that sort of workers in the U.S. have lost $3.7 trillion of collective wealth over the course of the pandemic, which is
astonishing.
Astonishing. And the billionaires have gained $3.9 trillion of wealth in the pandemic. So, you know, the rich get richer. And at $3.9 trillion, that is beyond comprehension to me.
I don't know.
I don't know what that means.
Right. I don't know what that means. I don't know. I can't even picture that. Right. I'm like sitting in the room that we're sitting in. I'm like, we didn't have stacks on stacks on stacks in this room, but I don't think this room would even fit. But I have no idea.
I have no concept of it.
Yeah. And we never will, I think.
Never will. The world will never know. All right. So for homework, what do we do to continue this work? One obvious thing is that this documentary is the last part of a trilogy about economic forces.
Yes.
So I think watching the other docs in the series would be great homework.
Yes.
The other thing I think is finding how we can submit those public comments to our city councils that challenge sort of the ethics and the motivations of constant growth and development for, apartment projects or whatever is going on, especially in the context of our local communities and how those things are going to impact us. So that's kind of where my homework sits, is like, I think continuing to learn, and then how do we learn and then apply that to action?
Yeah, this is a real call to
Yeah.
action for this. Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said, I mean, just miles away from us, not even there's construction that's happening, and it's like, what is going on? So, I love that. And I don't think I knew that this was part of a 3-part series. So that's news to me. So absolutely, let's watch the others. My homework may be a little superficial, if you will. I don't know. Or I think it's going to be a way for me to deal with this just curiosity that I have. I was really just so intrigued by Avenues.
Yeah.
The World School.
The World School.
I kind of want to learn a little bit more about that school. And I know that they have other locations sort of around the world.
They do. Yeah.
But other than the one that was featured in this film in Manhattan, but I want to learn more about Avenue's mission and educational model, right? I mean, you talked about the facility alone was just phenomenal, but their educational model was intriguing to me. And, they talk about how they're preparing students to be global citizens. And so, I was just fascinated by that. And so I want to check out their website. I want to read a little bit more about, who they are, what they do, how they're doing it. And I think that's the educator in me. But I also think there's a lot that I'm intrigued by in terms of what an institution like this one is doing to educate students to be these global citizens that they refer to.
Yeah.
But what does that mean in terms of being global citizens that are committed to social justice and liberation, right? Like, I think that's a key element of being a global citizen, right? This sort of interconnectedness with one another. I can't imagine anyone being a successful global citizen without having that commitment as well. So I just sort of want to see what they're doing just learn a little bit more about it. So it just is more curious than anything.
Yeah. I think those are good questions to ask of private schools, right? It connects back to what I was saying about what are the underlying purposes of these private schools, especially if you start to, I think, peel back some of the layers of the onion for like public charter schools too. Like what are those accomplishing, and what are some of the concerns that are very apparent from the experiences of students and parents who have gone there, and the lack of accountability for public dollars spent, and more. So, I don't think that's superficial. We're asking questions.
I love it.
All right, so let's talk about next week. So, Damien, you're up next week. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm super excited about next week. I'm bringing a piece called What's Next for Defund from In These Times magazine to the table. And if In These Times magazine sounds familiar, it's probably because we read the Movement for Black Lives Takeover edition of In These Times magazine back in August. Can you believe that was back in August?
Yeah.
So a few days ago, I actually got an email promoting this article, and I thought our podcast would be a great reason to read it. So I'm going to bring it to the table for us. And it's totally free to access this article online. So you can just search What's Next for Defund and In These Times magazine, and you will find it. But basically, it is a compilation of interviews of a few different folks. So there's Candace Montgomery, who is a Minnesota-based organizer and a national leader in the movement for Black Lives. And she's also the co-executive director of Black Visions. There's Robin Wansley Warloba, I hope I got that right, city councilor in Minneapolis. Andrew Harrison is a civil rights attorney and writer from Texas. Makia Green, who's an organizer, co-chair of Defund MPD Coalition, and co-founder of the Harriet's Wildest Dreams organization. And there's also Willie Burnley Jr., who is also an organizer, a city councilor from a town called Somerville in Massachusetts. And he's also the co-founder of Defund Somerville Police Department, right? So I think a lot of amazing folks, and the piece really sort of presents their reflections on the movement since the summer of 2020's uprisings and sort of where we go from here, and sort of their thoughts on where we go from here. And so I didn't read any of it, but I think it's going to be really a fascinating and insightful piece for us.
Definitely.
And so I'm looking forward to reading it and checking it out with you next week.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to reading and talking about that. It makes me think about all of the ways that a lot of folks on the right wing have talked about how departments have been defunded over the last 2 years, and that's a hoax.
Yep.
Like that is actually not true.
Yep.
In anywhere. No one was defunded.
Yep.
There were no police departments, as far as I know, across the country that were defunded. So when governors like, Glenn Youngkin come into power in Virginia, and they're like, we need to raise the funding, like the funding was never lowered.
Absolutely.
The funding was never cut. And so it's all propaganda. It's all manipulation of voters.
Yes.
That they're participating in doing. So I'm looking forward to reading more of that from sort of perspective of folks who are in that work and doing that work.
I love it.
So yeah. Well, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including YouTube. Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.